Outstanding. Okay. I also want to begin by thanking the organizers of this event. I can't deny to myself that I am actually really more pleased than I could have imagined that this happens in the Netherlands after a country from which I've been away for so many years. That means something to me. So I'm not going to give a sort of little history of myself or biography. I find this genre a little bit experimental, so I think I will address the various questions that Martin has put on the table, but maybe not quite in the order in which he's put them. So the first thing, yeah, of course, I'm particularly a little bit hesitant to pronounce on the history of critical discourse analysis. I'm glad that Martin has put a few things right in the beginning, maybe partially because I don't want to come out of here feeling that I'm history, which I'm not ready for. However, I had put and made a note, and I'm glad it has really already been done, to also say that it is not the case that critical discourse analysis started 20 years ago. And I also want to say that personally, you know, to me, the inspiration that first brought me to do it in my very early work on intonation came definitely from the work of Gunther and Bob in East Anglia, you know, and plus, and I'll say a bit more about that, some of the things that Marcuse wrote about language in the 60s, about language and technology. I came into linguistics via media studies, and this leads to something I want to say about CDA that I find important. And I just found that in media studies you cannot help but commune with a very wide range of approaches, and you have colleagues who read all sorts of things, and you're constantly, you know, feeling ignorant because you haven't read this, that, or the other. Whereas in linguistics, you know, much as I really wanted and desired to study language, I found it had succumbed to the kind of hyper-specialism that Marcuse had warned against, you know, and to subspecialisms that don't even talk to each other and are ignorant of what is happening right next door. And clearly, you know, that linguistics needed the kind of interdisciplinarity. It's a humanities discipline, in my view, that has always characterized the humanities, and we have to work towards some kind of new trivium or some kind of new coming together of different things you have to think about if you want to know about meaning in society and if you want to be able to explain things, you know. The beauty of critical discourse and analysis as I encountered it was that in that circle, which did indeed begin to have its annual meetings from 20 odd years ago, that sort of specialist zeal did not exist. You have been able to observe yourself already now how different we are and how different we talk. This has never been an obstacle to working together over the years and meeting together and enjoying that. It has been actually a discipline which, if that's what it is not even a discipline, but it has been multidisciplinary, multi-method, pluralist, tolerant. Any intolerance of critique came from the outside. And I might say one or two more things about it. So what mattered, as Teun is also often stressed, was a common goal which could be reached along different roads using different approaches to the study of language and discourse, different conceptual frameworks, and also, you know, welcoming, the way that I see it is critical discourse. I don't want to say I am a critical discourse. Critical discourse analysis is something I do amongst other things, you know, and there's about 3 other labels that I'm just as happy with if I do have to have a label. It is something you do. And so the critical discourse and analytical meetings that have been a real pleasure from year to year have always, you know, there have always been other people coming in who maybe most people wouldn't even think of critical discourse analysts, but who were welcome and who might have been just to 1 or 2 of those meetings and continue to be interested. And in fact, I've seen some of those people I'm referring to right here. So that common goal is important, and it is above all, you know, yeah, first of all, to do what Gunther also stressed, which I very much in agreement with, to not just describe, document, but to ask why. And to ask why, as I've also learned from my teacher Mark Halliday, is inevitably to have to ask, to look at society and to look at the social meanings, the social world that is ultimately the explanation of why things are, just as Gunther has explained with that nice example of using the past tense when you ask for an extension. I think we also, there's also the need to be critical, to dare to actually take on the responsibility that intellectuals should have of making judgments without needing to apologize for that. And the right to critique can no longer be taken for granted, and the attack on being critical does not only happen in oppressive regimes. People seem to often be afraid of doing so. In my work over the last 8 years, I had an administrative function in the University of Technology in Sydney as a dean. And I found all the time that when I was in meetings with the senior management and the other deans, if you said even very simple, very mild things like, should not we, we've been trying to, like say, we've been trying to do this for 3 years now, shouldn't we think about why it has failed for so far? People's eyes would glaze over and they would start looking at their watches and want to go on to the next thing. Interestingly, there was one exception who was in that circle the only person who did not come from the academic world but who came from banking. And they said, we maybe should listen to what Theo is saying. So, this kind of, ever since then, I've developed a sort of antenna for that, that fear of that critical voice that I encounter and I have encountered in many different ways, and that insistence that we now have in the world of being, in the neoliberal capitalist world, of being constantly upvibe and positive at all times, and that attitude towards critique as though they're some kind of spoil sports that actually trying to help and make things better. And that is something that is very much, it has also led to this idea, which I think is misplaced, of positive critical discourse analysis. Critical discourse analysis, I've also said that just the other week in Budapest, critic is always both positive and negative. Critic is, you can only critique things if it is, because either you think that things are disappearing that are worth keeping, or because things that are there, are not right and they have to change. One of the two. That means there are always values involved, positive values in critique. Critique is a positive thing to do, even when it appears to not be. So therefore, and I think that is something to keep in mind. At the most, we can say we have to work at being explicit of with both these sides of the coin. I think that, and critique is also very important. Now, when my very first work as an academic was the study of intonation, and I was studying the intonation of radio speakers. And I was right into becoming a real academic, and I was even learning. I was even doing experiments, and I was doing statistics. I was learning statistics and all that sort of stuff, And then I found that this thing that I'd gone into because it seemed interesting, that the results of what I had done were used in the speech in a speech synthesis laboratory at Macquarie University to create intonation patterns for speech synthesis of public announcements. The radio announcers I had been recording and had been participating willingly and happily in my research were thereby done out of a job because they got a nice bit of extra money for doing these public announcements at the time. It was the first time that I discovered that nothing that you do so-called out of interest, is actually not related to things in the world, that we have to be self-reflective as academics and think about the consequences of what we do. And every time I hear an academic say we do this and this because this is what we're interested in, this is what comes to my mind. Why are we interested in it? How does it relate to the world? What consequences do ideas have? And another prime example to me is the study of genre. In the early 1980s, when linguists began to study genre as in this distinction from what texts are about, but just as a series of actions, At the same time, people working, I found that in journals of ergonomics, human-computer interaction engineers were doing exactly the same thing. They were studying the language of receptionists so as to automatize it. And they studied this in the generic way that managers use when they want to regulate and organize your work, despite the protests of the experts and the professionals who thereby, whose work thereby changes fundamentally. That was the lesson of that first research in professional discourse. So. Then there's one more thing I want to also say. Now comes the it's a very funny place for me to be like this town, because just a few hundred meters from here is the Film Academy, where I spent 4 years learning, and even closer by, having in my youth wanting to be having a romantic idea of becoming an artist, a filmmaker, a writer, whatever. It was a time in the film school when when there was no way you could not discover politics, hence my references to my cursor. Indeed, we went with our cameras into the Maagdenhuis right here next door when there was this big uproar, and the Maagdenhuis was occupied by the students. We are here at the spot, which was the absolute center of political activity in Amsterdam, as Dutch people in the hall know. Right next door there's a little kind of statue on the middle of the Spui, around which the Provo meetings were held. So that was, and we at the film school we made a new journal called Screen, which continued to exist, although it changed for many years. So there was those kind of things were there, different from what other people have said. But I also want to say, I don't see myself necessarily as only being justified by an activist. I see myself as a teacher. And I think that the most important contribution we actually make to society is being a teacher. To teach critical awareness and to actually think how you do that. And to my books, I very much feel they are written for students. They are, I have the student in mind when I write them, and they're meant to open their eyes, help them understand the social and political world in which they live, and give them a language to talk about what they see. And over the last years, some of my most inspiring moments related to what we refer to as critical discourse analysis were, for example, a conference in Kuala Lumpur, where I think there were about 3 Europeans or North Americans, and where there were lots of young scholars, many of them young women from the Middle East, from North Africa, and so on, who were who had a sense of liberation about, doing critical discourse analysis. Same happens in other parts of the world. When David Machen and I had the study of Cosmopolitan magazine in Cardiff, David had the wonderful idea to say, instead of him going like a sort of ethnographer around the world, let's recruit local academics in all these countries, let them do, and then let them come to Cardiff to have a meeting. And at that meeting, there was a curious thing happening. There were a number of mostly cultural studies magazine specialists from Europe, and one from Australia as well. And there were these women who had worked with us from Vietnam, from Mexico, from lots of different places in the world. And these people thought critical discourse analysis was the way to do it. The woman from Vietnam even donned a traditional costume and called her talk the new enemy. And whereas the European people, they were into ethnography, they were into recording the voices of others and not speaking in their own voice. This was not understood by the other people. They said, why do you want to do that? To them, it was not interesting. And those are the kind of things that make me think, yes, the road on which we are, doing this kind of analysis with people, teaching it, bringing it into the world, is a good one. And one final point, relating actually to Teun's remark, I would say that one thing, apart from this, apart from those contexts across the world that are vital for critical discourse analysis, I agree with Teun that it is sometimes an issue. That we are coy about actually coming out with the values on which our judgments are being based. But I would say, as discourse analysts, we have exactly everything in-house to study the discourses that these values come from. let's make that one of our goals. We can't do that. We know, these discourses they float around, these values float around, as sort of buzzwords, keywords, fair, equal, power, let's just, follow the trail to where they come from as values in histories of the Enlightenment and in histories of Christianity and so on and so on, and not shirk the task of actually being quite open, where the values that are now sort of recognized but not understood, that are only half understood, where they really come from and what they really are. And I think that's probably as much as I want to say at this point. Thank you.